Last but certainly not least, we have Preston So, who's going to be talking about informational, conversational interfaces and the evolving role of voice content. So this will be voice-oriented. And he comes to us from Oracle and has a slew of experience. So we'll get a bit of a perspective on what this looks like at a very big corporation.
All righty, hello everybody. How are you all doing today?
Good.
Oh, come on. Okay, I know this is the last slot in the schedule, but how's everyone doing today? There we go. Now, because this is the very last slot, and I know that you all are probably still digesting lunch, if you would like to, I'd like to ask that everyone stands up, stretches a little bit, jiggles a little bit, just to get some of that blood flowing, because you got to have a little bit of stretching for later on when, obviously, there's whiskey involved. So maybe not whiskey involved, maybe food involved, right? All right, so thank you all so much. It's a real pleasure to be here at the European Chatbot and Conversational AI Summit. My name is Preston So, and I use he, him, they, them pronouns, and I am joining you here from New York City. Now, there we go. So today what I'm going to be talking about is specifically an area of conversational interfaces that are a little bit less prominent today, and voice content. But before that, who am I? So I write, speak, and work on the intersections of content, design, and code. What that means is that I focus on the intersections of content strategy, content design, UX writing, in regards to omni-channel and multimodal user experiences. I've written 4 books. I've got a new one coming out next month called Immersive Content and Usability. I also write coding books like Gatsby the Definitive Guide, and I've also written Voice Content and Usability, which is the book that I'll be pulling a little bit of content from today. Now, like every other speaker here at this conference, over the last few days, we've had some pretty big changes in our field happen, am I right? So I will be talking a little bit towards the end about some of the impacts of ChatGPT and the new revelations coming out from OpenAI. But I want to talk in this presentation specifically about voice, because voice is one of those things that many of us who work with written chatbots aren't really quite as used to. And I want to talk specifically about accessibility, because many of us are going over to chatbots, going over to voice bots, because we want to help disabled folks, the deaf community, be able to interface with not just written chatbots, but also with voice interfaces that are really good at delivering information and performing transactions that are otherwise not so easy. One of the things that we know, though, is that spoken or signed conversation is inherently messier than what we know of as written conversation. Obviously, we have huge corpuses of data that we can pull from, huge amounts of written content that we can pull from, terabytes upon terabytes of text that we can pull from, but voice is different. And one thing that we know about voice interactions is that they're very different. We have different kinds of conversations. We can really focus on the ways in which voice becomes a delivery mechanism for content. So consider, for example, the fact that many of the voice interfaces or chatbots that we've built up until recently have been focused on performing transactions, like ordering a pizza and fulfilling an order for pizza. But if we think about that other kind of voice interaction or conversational interaction, namely informational ones, we're really talking about delivering content, which is a fundamental and foundational cornerstone of what many of us are responsible for as conversation designers. We want to deliver facts. We want to deliver information that is essential to and crucial for somebody's success. And we now see, of course, a little bit of hybridization of these models where now folks like ChatGPT, OpenAI, are able to actually provide in a single conversational interaction, both of these things in one fell swoop. So voice content involves informational, not transactional interactions, like many of us have seen in chatbots. And one thing that's really important to note here is that voice content involves the transmission of information across time, not across space, like in our documents that we see on websites. Erica Hall in the book Conversational Design. How many people have read Erica Hall's book, by the way? Phenomenal book. I highly recommend it. It's one of the seminal works of conversation design from the perspective of usability and for folks who have worked with the web in the past. If you've come in from a web background or a mobile background, highly recommend this book. And one of the things that she writes in her book is the ideal interface is an interface that's not noticeable at all. And for those of us who work with voice interfaces or with chatbots, really what that means is that the kind of conversation that we're having with an interface should be indistinguishable from the kind of conversation that we're having with another human being, the conversational singularity, right? But of course, we do have an example of voice content that already exists. And this is where I get into a little bit of accessibility. We have the screen reader. And the screen reader is obviously a very venerated, respected, storied example of accessibility on the web today. But the problem is that screen readers don't really deploy content really that efficiently for disabled folks because of the fact that they are just reading off what's on the page, on a web page. And this is also one reason why a lot of voice interfaces struggle with that direct transposition of all of the same things that you do in chatbots that are written over to the spoken world. None of us actually speaks the way that we write. When we write to our friends, when we write things on social media, when we write articles, that's not the way that we actually speak when we're at a party or at a conference like this one. Of course, screen readers have a lot of amazing history. But one of the things that is really important to understand about screen readers is that if you talk to the disabled community, screen readers are actually not the friendliest user experience. Aaron Gustafson, for example, writes that one of the big problems with screen readers is that they translate visual design constructs into things that are oral or are verbal. But that only happens when you author these sorts of documents or have corpuses that are authored thoughtfully. And of course, screen readers aren't really that great for these use cases. I think one of the things that we know, if you talk to the accessibility community, is that screen readers exact a huge cognitive toll. One accessibility specialist named Chris Maury writes about this extensively. But think about the things that we have on the web. We have links, we have navigation bars, we have calls to action, form elements, multimedia, all things that don't really lend themselves to a chatbot or a voicebot experience. And Chris Maury writes this in Wired magazine. He says, why are screen readers designed the way that they are? It makes no sense to present information visually and then and only then translate that into audio. And you could actually make the same argument for translating chatbots that are written directly into spoken equivalents. One of the issues that I see a lot in a lot of people who do that, where they just say, let's just take that written chatbot and put a speech synthesizer in there and then we're done, is that you don't actually get natural speech. You don't actually get natural sounding language from doing that sort of approach. And oftentimes what we find is that voice interfaces can actually spirit users to their goals a lot more quickly than screen readers can. And when we think about multimodal accessibility, and I know that this is a topic that a lot of us deal with across our communities and organizations, one of the most important things that we should understand is that voice interfaces are a key fundamental aspect of that. And if you're somebody who only works with written chatbots, ask your team, ask your organization, ask your stakeholders, why don't we have a voice equivalent that works well for everyone in our base? So I want to talk about one case study that I was involved in that I led about 5 years ago. This is a little bit of an older case study, but you'll see why I'm talking about this later in the presentation. It's called Ask GeorgiaGov. And Ask GeorgiaGov was not only one of the first ever informational voice interfaces in existence. At this time, when the Alexa Skills Kit was released, this was back in 2016, 2017, there were very few voice interfaces and very few chatbots that were solely responsible for delivering content. A lot of them were responsible for checking your credit card balance or checking your bank balance or doing things that were much more transactional, ordering a pizza, for example, as opposed to delivering content. Now, one of the things that we know about state and local governments, about the public sector, is that the quality of information is extremely important to establishing user trust. If you have any sort of incorrect information or erroneous information, that's going to lead to huge problems down the road for your users. So what we did is we built and this is back at my time at Acquia, just to clarify, this is not my time at Oracle. We built a Alexa skill known as Ask GeorgiaGov, which was the first ever Alexa skill that was built for citizens of a state in the United States. What we did is we focused on the elderly audience, the disabled audience, and delivered every single piece of content that was available on the website's FAQ section to these folks at home. But one of the things that we know as content strategists is that juggling screen reader content and voice content, web content and voice content is very challenging. So a previous speaker here in this very room today, Esha, spoke about content silos. One of the things that you'll learn if you talk to any sort of omni-channel content strategist or omni-channel content designer is that managing multiple forms of content, especially when you're working with millions of pieces of content that need to be accurate, that all need to be verified, that all need to be audited, that all need to be under regulations, that's very, very challenging to do if you're having to manage both spoken content and written content, both web content and chatbot content, both web content and voice content. So one of the things that we did is to get rid of all of those silos. And you'll hear this a lot from a lot of omnichannel strategists. The answer is to unify all of your content into a single corpus that makes sense for every single possible touch point, every single possible channel where that content's going to end up. So what we did is we focused on two different things. We focused on two aspects of content and two characteristics of content that are very important, especially for non-visual interfaces like voice interfaces. Less important for chatbots because chatbots have visual affordances that allow for you to see a little bit of that hierarchy, a little bit of that information architecture underneath. But discoverability, is it discoverable for people who aren't just following links but are actually using dialogue flows? And also, content legibility. Is it something that you can actually access when you are on a voice interface in terms of reading and listening to that content? So what we did with GeorgiaGov is we took every single page on the FAQ section, and this involves things like registering to vote, saving for university, because in the United States, and anyways, I don't want to get into all of that. But what we did is we took all of these pages that have really crucial content for citizens of Georgia and turned them into hierarchical graphs that we could then translate into a format that was really great and convenient for a voice interface. For example, a question and an answer, like a normal FAQ. What we did is we did what I call a content audit, a channel-driven content audit. And what I mean by that is we looked at every single piece of content, analyzed every single piece of that chunk of content that was available in that corpus of content, and we looked at, all right, are there things in here that are less amenable for a voice interface? Are there things in here that might confuse a user who's getting to this in a voice interface? Once again, less of a concern for those of us who work with written chatbots because you can put a link in a chatbot message, but you can't put a link in a voice message on an Alexa device. And of course, one of the other things that differentiates the United States from European governments is that we only have a certain amount of resources and we're very cash-strapped. And so the Georgia editorial team, they could only manage one single version of their content. They said we can only do one piece of content per content that we have for web, mobile, voice, chatbot, what have you. So the things that we did are we took out things like links, calls to action, things that were nonsensical. You can find out a lot more about this in my book. I don't want to dwell too much on this for time reasons. But a lot of the things that we did were really about making these entities in the content corpus more searchable, more identifiable, more easy to understand, more unambiguous for those who are interacting with it on a voice interface. So the other thing that we did, of course, is to focus on the conversation design, right? Obviously, one of the things that you can't do in a website is to provide a voice interaction there, unless, of course, you are going to put in a gimmicky voice tool on your website. So we focused on writing sample dialogues and designing conversations in ways that allowed for users to traverse this hierarchy in a very clear way without resorting to things that we know are a little bit less usable, like spoken menus and the like. So as you can see here, when the user interacts, and by the way, this is not a written conversation, this is a spoken conversation, this is a voice bot conversation. What we focused on was to allow for the user to access any of the information that they wanted to get to on the website simply by conducting a site-wide search through the Alexa skill. And of course, what that means is that we drill down further and further. We get to the point where the user has been able to identify their intent of saying, hey, I want this information sounds correct, and it moves on from there. Now, one of the things that we did was to focus on, obviously, certain things in voice that are differentiated from chatbot design is you get a lot less of that memory retention in voice. You can't really remember what happened 30 seconds ago in a voice interface conversation. In a chatbot, all you got to do is scroll up. You can just scroll up, a few screens, and you see the history of the conversation right there. But you can't do that on a voice interface. And so one of the things that I always share with those who are designing conversations for voice is to focus on directive, prescriptive prompts that give the user a very clear way to proceed if they don't have that visual reference to go off of. Another thing that I always recommend as well is explicit confirmation, which allows for the user, sorry, not explicit confirmation, but for implicit confirmation. Because here's the problem. If you just go into this realm of saying, well, I'm only going to confirm, and then force the user to respond right away with a further kind of back and forth. With voice, that's not just a problem of the amount of time that the user has to think about. It's also a cognitive overload on the user's mind, because now they have to respond back and forth and keep on reacting in a way that's this pitter-patter that constantly is exhausting for the user. And so with implicit confirmation, what we did is just dive right into it and say, well, hey, I heard you say driver's licenses, and just proceed with the content, because the user doesn't want to have to wait for that information in a voice conversation. Think about this. If you're having a customer service interaction, you don't want for somebody to just ask you a question and then you have to say yes to every single thing that they say. You want them to proceed without any further delay. Another thing that we did, obviously, and this was back in the days when designing flows and doing dialogue flow design wasn't something that was so well established. This was before the days of dialogue flow, before the days of a lot of the tools that we have today. But one of the things that we focused on, just to skip these slides here, was to really focus on error recovery, because errors are a lot more common, are a lot more ubiquitous in voice interfaces. One of the things that you'll discover in voice interface design is that you really have to handle errors really, really well, because you're going to get a lot more of them. You're going to get non-understanding errors. You're going to get a lot of no-match errors when you go to voice. But ultimately what we did here was to actually create a very compelling dialogue flow that allowed for us to really directly translate this entire hierarchical structure into the Amazon Alexa skill that we built. Now, just a few final notes here about user testing. How many people do usability testing in here for chatbots? Okay. So voice interfaces demand a very different kind of usability testing from chatbot testing. And the reason for that is that you're fundamentally asking the user to have a spoken conversation with the interface. What that means is that retrospective techniques, the ones where you ask the user what happened afterwards as opposed to asking them during the interaction, are a lot easier. With a chatbot, obviously that's written, you can ask the user while they're typing away or while they're waiting for the response from the chatbot to give their impressions. But in a voice interface, you really can't do that as easily unless you can turn off that spoken interface and get that insight right then and there. So what we did is we asked questions at the end about the information that they received, the content that was delivered. And we found 8 months later that we had a 79.2% success rate on all the interactions, which is a very, very high success rate when it came to the year 2017, 2018. And also a bunch of data that we actually provided in an analytics dashboard. But I want to end here with one brief kind of funny story about voice. And that is that when you're designing a voice interface, obviously because of the fact that speech synthesis and speech understanding are things that are really, really challenging, sometimes you're going to get some really funny and awkward situations. One example was we kept finding a lot of 404 errors pop up for this word that popped up over and over and over and over again. Lawsons, Lawsons, Lawsons. We scratched our heads in the meeting room. We were like, who is this person who's just asking about this brand name, this proper noun? What is this? We eventually found out that it was a native Georgian from the state of the United States who was saying the word license, as in driver's license, with a southern Georgia drawl. So no matter how much you try to perfect your voice interface, these sorts of things are going to happen. So I want to stop here and share sort of my thoughts because of the fact that we've had these big developments happen over the last few days about content in relation to conversation design, content in relation to trust, and content in relation to how we think about our interactions with the user interfaces that we are building. One thing that really worries me about the current trajectory of where we're headed with OpenAI and obviously the just announced GPT-4 is that, as we've seen from the demos of Google Bard, as we've seen from the demos of Bing most recently, these interfaces actually commit some pretty glaring factual errors. But for those of us who are working in companies and in organizations and in governments where factual errors can be a life and death decision, the amount of trust, especially in this era, when there is absolutely the lowest level of trust, of public trust in governments that we've ever had in the history of modernity, it's a very, very worrying thing. Because one of the big things that we find in the public sector, in the healthcare industry, in all of our corporate communications, all of the content strategies that we work in on a daily basis, is that the quality of the content that we produce, how we transmit information, is something that goes through multiple stakeholders, multiple rounds of reviews, multiple stages of auditing and verification. We really, really carefully work on content to be correct and accurate all of the time. And we're talking about these predictive AI tools, LLMs, that are now potentially scrambling and you never get the same paragraph the same time once again. We really now need to have a very, very important conversation about what sorts of trust we can build with our users when the responses that we're giving them, that we're issuing, might not be the same. But they should be the same when it comes to a high trust interaction with somebody like a government, somebody like a hospital, somebody like a health insurance company. All of these things mean that the delivery of content is something that we have to be particularly watchful of when it comes to the ethics of our chatbot design, when it comes to the usability of our chatbots and our voice bots, and of course, the equity of all of the above. Thank you very much.
We have time for one question, and then we'll take a pause to give enough time for folks from upstairs to come down, and then Kate and I will close our event. So one question from the audience. Last question until next year. All right, there we go.
Hi. You mentioned, the example about the Georgia accent. I used to work on Amazon Alexa, so I'm familiar with issues with dialects. I'm just wondering, from a usability testing standpoint for voice applications, do you have suggestions for best practices, how to get a representative user sample when you're testing so you can avoid issues like this? And especially with trust, people who have non-standard dialects usually, don't even engage with voice because they're like, it doesn't understand me. This is useless.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the question. That's a great question. So there's multiple issues at hand in this quandary that you've brought up. One obviously is inequity and the marginalization that a lot of folks face. And the other one comes down to obviously just recruitment of usability test participants. So there's been a lot of discussion, as probably most of you know, over the last few years about equitable usability testing. One thing that I've learned, for example, over the last few years is that usability tests, just like a lot of medical studies in today's day and age, are really biased towards those with economic privilege and those with other forms of privilege. And so one of the things that is very important is if you're building a usability testing practice that involves chatbots, that involves voice, and you want to get those less heard dialects, for example, as you're testing your speech understanding and things of that nature, you need to offer paid incentives. And those paid incentives need to be differentiated based on the particular inequities that people face. If somebody is facing intersectionally complex marginalization, you need to offer paid incentives that reflect those dimensions of oppression. One thing that we really did is we focused on offering incentives. We offered gift cards. But we unfortunately didn't offer differentiated incentives that would allow for us to have recruited participants from very, very different backgrounds from our own. And so this is one of those things that I think is very important as many of you think about voice bots and voice interfaces in addition to written chatbot design. Obviously, one of the really nice rich, amazing things that makes us human, makes us such amazing people, is that we have a very rich array of forms that we speak, which are flattened when it comes to written interactions. The textual interactions that we have in our chatbot interfaces are things that actually completely nullify and in many ways erase the richness of how we speak. And so I would end today with this response to this amazing question, thank you, by saying that if you are going to be moving into the voice world as well, if you're going to be moving your chatbots into the voice dimension, into the axis of voice, please make sure to account for the fact that the richness that we have in our humanity is not just in how we write, it is also in how we speak.
Thank you so much, Preston, for that detailed presentation.